Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and colleagues and friends. It's always wonderful to see so many faces I recognise in this large and enthusiastic audience. It's a great privilege as Principal of St Edmund Hall to welcome you to the 2025 Geddes Lecture. This lecture, as many of you will know, is held every year and has been held every year since 1998 in memory of Philip Geddes, who is an alumnus of the Hall. Philip arrived at St Edmund Hall in 1977 to study English, and following his graduation, he embarked on a highly successful career in journalism. He began his career at the London Evening Standard and later moved on to the Daily Express, quickly becoming a rising star in journalism. However, in 1983, while at Harrods in Knightsbridge, London, the building was ordered to be evacuated due to a bomb threat. As an aspiring journalist, Philip saw the potential for a story, and rather than fleeing the scene, he chose to investigate. Tragically, the IRA bomb that had been planted exploded, taking his life along with several others, including policemen and innocent bystanders. Philip was only 24 at the time, and his death marked a profound loss to all who knew him and to generations to follow. At our college at St Edmund Hall, we have a tree and a plaque in our gardens to honour his memory. In tribute to Philip's legacy, the Geddes Trust was established in collaboration with St Edmund Hall with the goal of fostering excellence in journalism. The Trust supports students by awarding prizes, and thanks to generous donations, it's expanded these prizes to include the Clive Taylor Prize for Sports Journalism, the Ronnie Payne Prize for Foreign Reporting, and this year the Trust is proud to award the first Paddy Coulter Prize for Opinion Journalism. The Trust is made up of a group of exceptional trustees, many of them who are here today, and since 1988, St Edmund Hall has had the honour of hosting a distinguished speaker to deliver the Philip Geddes Annual Lecture. And this year is no different. So now it's my very great pleasure to invite John Ryder, the chair of the Geddes Trust, to the stage to introduce the speaker for this year. John, thank you.
Good evening. Tonight is a moment to celebrate achievement, a moment to celebrate success. But it is also a moment to recognise the world order has been turned upside down. Turned upside down in a short week. Turned upside down by Donald Trump. So what will the American president do next? We'll hear in a moment from Gabriel Gatehouse, who's about to deliver a 2025 Geddes Lecture. Gabriel knows better than most journalists what the future might hold. But first, let us pay tribute to one of our former Geddes trustees, Paddy Coulter. Paddy died last November. Paddy was a sterling supporter of the Geddes Trust for many years. Paddy was an inspiring fellow trustee, and Paddy was modest. You'd have never have known that 40 years ago, Paddy dared to challenge the tyranny of the status quo. He was an activist. He was a journalist. He took on the established media and won the argument about famine in Africa should be reported. He cared. The Geddes Trusts have decided to introduce an award in his memory, the Paddy Coulter Prize for Opinion Journalism. We are pleased his widow, Angela, is here this evening. The Geddes Trust is a passionate believer in journalists who care, who stand up for what they believe in, journalists who care about accuracy, journalists who care about impartiality in this world awash with falsehoods, false facts, and half-truths. Getting the news right is so very important. Right now, democracy depends on it. It really does. And the Geddes Trust, in a small way, can contribute to that big endeavour to encourage tomorrow's editorial leaders, to encourage tomorrow's top journalists, to encourage tomorrow's cutting-edge publishers, to put accuracy and impartiality first. And today, the Geddes Trust has awarded 4 journalism prizes to encourage young journalists. Our winners have all been selected on the basis of the quality of the pieces they submitted, the project they proposed, and an interview. Let me tell you very briefly about the winners. The Clive Taylor Prize for Sports Journalism has been won by Samantha Martin in her second year reading history at Somerville. Samantha will use the money to compare France's top horse race, the Arc in Paris, with the Grand National at Aintree. The Ronnie Payne Prize for Foreign Reporting goes to Samir Bashar at St Anne's, reading a Master's in Health Science. He will examine stigmatism in our society. The inaugural Paddy Calder Prize for Opinion Journalism goes to Flora Prideaux, a third-year history student at Somerville. Flora will travel to the next big climate conference, COP30, to see whether or not the proceedings and the language used by the decision makers there can be translated into ordinary language for the rest of us. And the 2025 Philip Geddes Memorial Prize for the most promising student has been won by Anjan Mashra, a third-year student at Exeter College studying English literature. His project is to travel to America to explore the influence Indian Americans have on politics in the United States. You are an outstanding bunch of people. The standard of entries was really high this year. Be very proud of what you've achieved, and the trustees wish you all the very best of luck. Please could the 4 winners stand up? Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. So, to tonight's Geddes lecture, entitled Trump 2.0, What America's Rabbit Holes Tell Us About the Future. We're very lucky indeed to have here tonight Gabriel Gatehouse, formidable journalist, coming storm author, and supremo podcaster. After Gabriel has spoken, Alison Phillips, a Geddes trustee and former editor-in-chief of the Daily Mirror, will talk to Gabriel about what he said. And then, after that, the discussion will be thrown open to you for questions. There are a couple of roving mics. Gabriel spent 4 years exploring what he calls the rabbit holes of America, investigating the conspiracy theories, delving into the politics, digging into the technology. Gabriel spotted the emergence of the tech bros, keen to push the frontiers of the United States of America. Gabriel spotted the influence internet trolls play in disrupting the facts. Gabriel, the lectern is yours.
Thank you very much for that dramatic, I would almost say, John Sweeney-esque introduction. Is that an adjective? It had a Sweeney-esque, my former colleague from Newsnight and famous dramatizer of events, John Sweeney. Anyway, thank you. Very generous indeed. I took this very seriously. This is a lecture, so I wrote a lot of words on a piece of paper, and I'm going to get a glass of water before I begin, and then I'm going to read them. But first, water. Am I still? Yeah, I'm still mic'd up. Yeah, so I took it very seriously. I wrote a lot of words. And what I did, because it's, usually I'm a broadcast journalist, I'm used to just kind of standing up and winging it. But because it's a lecture, I wrote down what I was going to tell you before I then tell it to you. And probably at the end of it, I'll sum up what I've told you. So here goes. In this lecture, I'm going to look at the role of journalism in a very rapidly changing geopolitical and technological environment. These changes have got massive implications for the future and stability of our world, which seems all of a sudden to be in real jeopardy after many years of greater or lesser stability. But it goes deeper than that. the implications are for how we perceive reality itself. And I was going to ease into this all with a kind of gentle, meandering anecdote from a quarter of a century ago when I first started out in journalism. And everything seemed so different. But then I was in the middle of writing it, and bang, there was that meeting in the Oval Office between Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, his vice president, and Volodymyr Zelensky. The whole spectacle was so explosive, so fundamentally altering of America, at least I thought, and its relationship to Europe and the rest of the world. The whole global order that has been in place since the end of the Second World War, that I think we should just spend a little bit of time in that meeting. So to recap briefly, the president of Ukraine, physically small in stature, but dressed in his usual battle fatigues, arrived at the White House to sign away a chunk of his country's mineral wealth in exchange for some pretty dubious security guarantees. I say dubious because Trump had already made it clear in the previous weeks that he considered Zelensky a dictator and Putin a great guy. He should never have started it, Trump said about the war in Russia, and Zelensky, who of course had started nothing. His country was invaded, unprovoked, by its much bigger neighbor. Now, we're used to these kinds of reality inversions by now. I've come to think of them as the key feature of Trump. It's the ultimate power play, the ultimate flex, right? He's saying, look, I can make reality whatever I want it to be through my words and my actions. Whatever it is that you know you yourself have done, whatever you think you've seen with your own eyes and ears, the thousands of your fellow countrymen killed by an invading force, I could flip it on its head and then flip it round again tomorrow if I like. This isn't unique to Trump. It's a feature of many a totalitarian or strongman system. But it is uniquely suited to and uniquely dangerous in this moment in history. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But first, that meeting. When you're on your knees, what are you going to do? Cut a deal, right? The deal, by all accounts, was a pretty humiliating one for Ukraine, which, of course, is how Donald Trump likes it. And it seems that it wasn't quite humiliating enough. So he and J.D. Vance staged a sort of public hazing, a schoolyard bullying ritual in front of the cameras, stuffing the new boy's head into a diplomatic toilet bowl while braying at him to be more grateful, more respectful. Actually, scrap the schoolyard metaphor. It was a mafia shakedown, right? Nice country you've got there. Shame if anything terrible should happen to it. Now give us your minerals. If this was The Godfather, we'd have Sonny Corleone in the White House, the James Caan character. Marlon Brando, the respected old Don, is dead, but instead of being replaced by Michael, the quiet, clever, ruthless one, we've got Sonny, the brash brother who can never stop himself from mouthing off at the wrong moment. This scene in the Oval Office will live on in infamy. It was horrible to watch. But the weird thing about it was that Trump, and by extension America, came out of it, I thought, looking weaker and more pathetic than Zelensky, who emerged looking frustrated and flustered, and who undoubtedly had kind of fluffed it, but with his dignity intact. The display that Trump and Vance put on, this was not the posture of a great power. It appeared unthinking, a strategic blunder, the wanton act of a president who, in Freudian terms, is pure id, acting almost unconsciously on all his basest instincts. Trump kept telling Zelensky that he didn't have very good cards. Zelensky protesting he wasn't playing cards. He was fighting for his country's very existence. But the truth is that Trump, who had pretty much all the cards, played them so badly that he lost the hand. The world saw America for what it is, a once great power on the downswing, lashing out at its allies, ingratiating itself with its foes. That moment distilled the empty promise of MAGA, Make America Great Again. Trump revealed himself as the leader of a much diminished America, whose 80-year stint as the guarantor of freedom and democracy in Europe has come to an end. And Europe, of course, has taken note. That's what we've been seeing in the last week, hearing on our news bulletins, scrambling belatedly to try and figure out how it can stand on its own feet. How can you base your security on guarantees from an administration whose word means nothing, one that stabs its allies in the back, and crucially, with whom you have no shared factual frame of reference? The answer is you can't. So whatever words we may hear from people like Keir Starmer about our bond with America remaining strong, these really are just words now. The transatlantic alliance is surely dead, and the post-war status quo is shattered. What's that saying about there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen? I've been a journalist for the last quarter of a century, mostly as a foreign correspondent in the news business. And when you're in the news business, there needs to be constantly something happening, right? Even when there isn't, not really. My first job in journalism was at the BBC World Service, at the Russian service. We were broadcasting world news in Russian to Russia. I'd studied Russian language and literature in the mid-1990s, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, when, famously, history had come to an end. So I started out 25 years ago, and I want to tell you a little story, that gentle, meandering anecdote that I promised earlier, as an illustration of how much journalism and geopolitics has changed in that time. It was 2002. I was just finding my feet as a junior producer at the Russian service, based in Bush House on the Strand in London. 9/11 had happened, and the invasion of Afghanistan. And it was becoming clear that the United States was determined to go further. They were going to go to war in Iraq. And back in those olden days, before the internet had broken the establishment media's grip on the distribution of information, journalists had this strangely dual role when it came to dealing with politicians. So on the one hand, it was our job to hold powerful figures to account by asking them difficult questions. My former colleague from Newsnight, Jeremy Paxman, was probably the ultimate expression of that kind of journalist. A man who could hold someone's feet to the fire like no other. It was joyous and sometimes quite painful to watch. But also, in this system, everyone knew that the journalist and the broadcaster or the newspaper was a conduit, a vehicle for a powerful figure to communicate his or her message. They needed us, and we needed them. It was, and remains, a sometimes uncomfortable symbiosis. Anyway, back to 2002. The Russian service was no Newsnight. We didn't have senior politicians knocking on our studio doors begging for a grilling. But one day, we got a call from Downing Street. The Prime Minister wanted someone from the Russian service to come and interview him. Tony Blair had pledged that Britain would stand shoulder to shoulder with George W. Bush as America prepared to send forces into Iraq and liberate its people from tyranny. Blair was embarking on a world tour, trying to put together a coalition of the willing. He was flying to Moscow to try to persuade the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, less than 2 years into the job, to sign up to this endeavor. These are the days, if you can remember back then, there was talk of Russia joining NATO. There were these different times. Anyway, Blair wanted to put his case to the Russian people directly ahead of his visit, hence the call from Downing Street. Now, my editor at the Russian service was a man who'd learned his trade in the Soviet Union. He'd been TASS correspondent in Baghdad in the 1980s. He was a decent guy, but no Paxman. This was more of a conduit situation than a grilling. Anyway, we packed up our boxes of microphones and recording equipment and headed over. Blair's pitch was this. Saddam Hussein was a dictator. As such, he represented a threat not only to his own people, but to the rest of the world. Russia, itself recently liberated from its own tyrannical regime and now ostensibly part of the community of democratic nations, should join this noble crusade to spread democracy around the world. Freedom was on the march, was the argument. The Russians, of all people, ought to recognize that. Time to pick a side. We recorded the interview, and we sped back to Bush House in a black cab to edit the scoop in time for the lunchtime news program. It was a tight turnaround, and if you can believe this, at the time, a lot of the world service was still analog, broadcasting on tape. My job was to edit the interview on a reel of quarter-inch tape, splicing the clips with a razor blade and sticking them together with sticky tape. I was still slashing away with my razor as the bulletin began, and I remember running down 6 flights of steps in Bush House with the finished reel in my hand, leaving a little trickle of blood on the stairs behind me, having nicked my finger in the edit. I burst into the studio. The presenter was already reading the introduction. I slammed the reel onto the tape machine, threaded it through, and we made it to air with seconds to spare. Fun times. Of course, from Bush and Blair's perspective, they was all for naught. Russia, sensibly enough, did not sign up to America's disastrous war. By the time the Americans formally withdrew, 9 years later in December 2011, more than 100,000 people were dead, and that's by the very most conservative estimates. The United States had ceded most of its influence in the region to Iran, and no one was under any illusions anymore about Russia's part in the community of democratic states. But the broader geopolitical picture remained essentially intact. America was still the leader of the free world, the absolute backstop and guarantor of freedom and democracy in the West. The French philosopher Jean Baudrillard famously maintained that the predecessor to that war, the first Gulf War, launched by Bush Sr. in 1991, never actually happened. It was, he said, a made-for-media spectacle designed to be consumed through our TV screens, our radio sets, our newspapers. A piece of theatre. Now, I don't know if there are any philosophy undergrads or postgrads here, but I'm sure some of you learned that it's not necessarily a good idea to take French philosophers too literally. And in one sense, Baudrillard's assertion is palpable nonsense, right? Of course the war happened. But in another, it isn't. Because what I think Baudrillard is saying, if we apply it, say, to the Second Gulf War, is that the supposed purpose of the war, to remove a dictator in the furtherance of the twin ideals of freedom and democracy, turned out not to be the purpose at all. It turned out that America and Britain, first of all, were led to war in Iraq based on a pack of lies about weapons of mass destruction. The people who benefited most from the exercise were not Iraqis liberated from tyranny, but some big American defense contractors, in some cases, coincidentally, very coincidentally, with financial ties to the Bush administration. Oh, and the government in Tehran, of course, whose power and influence grew exponentially following the toppling of Saddam Hussein. When I was the BBC's Baghdad correspondent towards the end of the noughties, a senior Iraqi official told me, possibly in jest, that if the US invasion of his country wasn't an Iranian plot from the beginning, then it jolly well should have been. Anyway, the point is that the Iraq war was really just business as usual, despite the oceans of newsprint and the hours and hours of breathless broadcast coverage to which I contributed when I was Baghdad correspondent. Really, nothing much changed. It was a decade when little happened. In this age where we're deluged with information, with news about stuff happening, where we all carry about in our pockets this little machine that's constantly beeping at us about the next big thing that demands our attention, our raised heart rates and our adrenaline, it's important to distinguish between the stuff that is actually going to affect our lives and the stuff that isn't. And the stuff that's been happening in America these past few weeks is really, really going to change things. So just to sum up, A pathological liar and fantasist with clear totalitarian instincts has regained power with a whopping democratic mandate. Upon entering the White House, Donald Trump has proceeded to take the global security policy of the United States, in place since the end of the Second World War, and turn it on its head. Instead of America standing as guarantor of peace and freedom in Europe, Trump has aligned the United States with its old foe, Russia, which is led by an oppressive and malign kleptocrat. And unlike during his first term, when he was often isolated and surrounded by establishment figures whose instincts mostly stopped short of tearing down the whole system, Trump has staffed his second administration with wild conspiracy theorists, people who believe the institutions of the American state are rotten to the core, captured by a deep state cabal of pedophiles and Frankenstein doctors, creating chimeric diseases as part of a secret and ethnically targeted bioweapons program. Hello, Bobby Kennedy Jr. These people's stated aim is the destruction of the very institutions they now run. Attentive observers of America might have seen this coming down the tracks for a while now. But to watch it actually happen in real time and at speed, well, it's taken my breath away more than once this past week. So yeah, there are weeks when decades happen, and these are some of those weeks. That quote, by the way, anyone know who it's attributed to? Lenin. There's no evidence that Lenin actually said that, but it is attributed to Lenin. As far as I can tell, the origins are a 2001 article by George Galloway in The Guardian. A man who, like Donald Trump, has a good way with words and admires an oppressive dictator. Anyway, the days when we'd let mere facts like that get in the way of a good narrative are long gone, right? So let's stick with Lenin. Vladimir Ilyich. He was a man who knew a thing or two about epochal change, how to precipitate it, how to ram it through, so that by the time the rest of society, punch-drunk, figured out what had happened, it was too late. Facts on the ground had changed. The world had turned, and a new era had begun. Like all great changes, the one precipitated by Lenin went hand in hand with some technological shift. In the case of the Russian Revolution, it was, you might argue, the shift from horsepower to steam and then the internal combustion engine. The Industrial Revolution, followed by a great change in military technology, tanks instead of horses. It was a big shift. But compared to the shift that we're in the middle of, or perhaps more accurately, the shift we're just at the beginning of now, this one is much more fundamental. The shift we're undergoing is not about how machinery is operated or about how things get around. It's about information. It's about how everything we experience, everything we see and hear and read gets into our brains. It's about how we experience the world around us. Naomi Alderman, the brilliant sci-fi novelist and video game developer, calls the era we're in today the third information crisis. The first information crisis was the invention of writing, the shift from oral to written culture that coincided with the move away from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural ones. Big change, that. She argues that lots of the stories you'll find in the Old Testament are really about this shift. It's a fascinating thought. The second information crisis was precipitated by the printing press. It was the invention that broke the feudal world order, greased the wheels of the Reformation, helped Europe to dominate the world, led to the rise of capitalism and the cult of the individual. The printing press gave birth to the world I was born into in the late 1970s. The tail end of that world, it would turn out. Some of you in this room were born at the very beginning of a new epoch, at the start of Alderman's third information crisis. And just as the changes precipitated by the printing press, the shift from feudalism to capitalism, happened pretty quickly compared to the move from nomadic to settled societies, a period of centuries rather than millennia. So the shift we're experiencing right now is happening even faster. Within the next few decades, I believe, our whole world is going to change. Everything we knew, everything our parents knew, all the certainties we thought we were born into are going to disappear, from systems of government, societal structures, to our understanding of reality itself. The piece of tech responsible for this crisis is, of course, the computer, the internet, digital technology. And just as 500 years ago, momentous change began in the place where the printing press was invented, in Western Europe, and then spread throughout the world, so today the epicenter of change is in America, the cradle of our digital civilization. To go back to that meeting in the Oval Office for a moment, did you notice there was a point where J.D. Vance was hectoring Zelensky about recruitment problems in the Ukrainian military? Have you actually been to Ukraine to see what kind of problems we have? Zelensky countered. Vance's reply was extremely telling. He held up his hands like this, in the shape of a phone, and he said, "I've seen the stories." In other words, I don't need to look at the real world. My feed is my world. My algorithm is my reality. And my screen-mediated reality, sitting here in Washington, D.C., is as valid as yours, Mr. Zelensky, sitting in your bunker under Russian missile fire. In fact, it's more valid, because I am more powerful. How, as journalists, do we deal with this? It's a real challenge. And by challenge, I mean problem. In totalitarian systems of old, one of the main tools for manipulating reality alongside propaganda was censorship. The Soviet Union did it, of course. It stopped information from outside coming in. That was the whole point of the BBC's Russian service, to get real, true information in there. And the Soviet authorities regularly blocked us. In fact, I remember in the early 2000s, as digital technology was reducing the power and reach of the BBC's shortwave broadcasts into Russia, old people at the Russian service would only half-jokingly reminisce fondly about the days when the BBC's transmissions were jammed by Moscow. The very act of blocking the BBC imbued us with power and authority. What's so strange about today's media ecosystem is that, on the one hand, the internet has made information so much more accessible. It's almost impossible to block people's access to information. A simple VPN will allow you to get around most geoblocks. But at the same time, the need to block information seems to have all but disappeared, because we're all busy siloing ourselves into information ghettos. There's nothing that prevents anyone from accessing facts about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, from knowing that Donald Trump's assertion that Zelensky should never have started the war is patently absurd, and that when Trump denies ever having said that Zelensky was a dictator, having said just that on camera a few days previously, he's engaged in gaslighting of the most blatant kind. All these facts are freely available to anyone, even if they are partially buried by an algorithm that is designed to feed you more of what you already believe. But when a fervent MAGA supporter encounters these facts, it doesn't make them reevaluate. No, the encounter with information that contradicts their worldview triggers a burst of cortisol that sends them deeper into their silo, that makes them more convinced that those who see the world differently are mendacious, malign, and a threat to their existence. So what we have right now is quite a dangerous situation. In the past, people who inhabited quite different information ecosystems tended also to be physically and politically separated from one another. Think Americans and Russians during the Cold War. Now, we have people who inhabit totally different worlds, physically butting up against one another on a daily basis, at the grocery store, football game, at the polling booth. This is explosive. Now, I'm afraid this cuts both ways. That is to say that liberals, those who don't want to tear down the post-war order, those who might be inclined to look at what is happening in America at the moment and despair, which includes me, and I suspect at least some of the people in this room. These people are also susceptible to this same siloing instinct. Let me quickly tell you an anecdote, a story that those of you who've listened to The Coming Storm or read the book might be familiar with, but it bears repeating. In November 2020, in the aftermath of the last US presidential election but one, I was in Phoenix, Arizona, reporting for Newsnight on this nascent movement called Stop the Steal. The election had been called for Joe Biden, but many of Trump's supporters suspected foul play. I was there with a small group of them, a motley crowd, families with kids, men with huge guns. And I spot this guy in an eye-catching outfit. He's bare-chested, draped in furs, horns on his head. Now, TV journalism is obviously a visual medium, and this guy looked brilliant. So I wandered over for a chat. Friendly guy. Nice guy. But the story he told me went far beyond spurious allegations of voter fraud. He believed a deep state cabal of satanic pedophiles led by Hillary Clinton had captured the levers of power in the United States, and Donald Trump was engaged in a secret battle to expose them. Too bonkers to put on TV. Not for Newsnight. So I ignored him. Big mistake. 2 months later, I was back in London, glued to my TV screen, watching a mob much larger than the one I'd seen in Arizona storm the United States Capitol. And there he was. Same guy. Same furs. Same horns on his head. My old friend Jake Chansley from outside the counting house in Arizona. The guy I thought was too mad to interview. What exactly was the significance of him and the story that he told me? And how had I missed that significance? That was what I set out to investigate when I began my reporting on the coming storm, and it led me down this series of increasingly Byzantine rabbit holes, at the end of which I realized something. Just because this one story about Hillary Clinton and the cabal of satanic pedophiles was patently nonsense, I was wrong to dismiss everything that this man was telling me. The story that had got lodged in his head, bogus though it was, nevertheless pointed to something true, namely, that democracy in America, and by extension in many Western countries, is suffering a crisis of legitimacy. The way the world is currently set up, the system of globalized capitalism we're currently living under, it serves some people a lot better than others. In fact, it serves vast swathes of the electorate very poorly, especially in the United States, but also over here. And some of those stories that were floating around in the magosphere, that existed alongside the cabal of pedophiles story, were in fact largely true. There was the story of Hunter Biden's laptop, for example, dismissed as Russian disinformation, banned on Facebook and Twitter. Turned out to be legit. I had a look at it. And while the laptop didn't prove that Joe Biden and his son were criminals, as Trump and his allies claimed, it nevertheless pointed to a system of essentially legalized corruption, in which those with power and resources can continue to enrich themselves at a time when many are experiencing increased hardship. And you can say, wasn't it ever thus? When did we ever live in utopia? Fair enough. But the story that democracy tells us, especially the story of America, is that when a situation becomes untenable, you can raise your voice and change things through the democratic process. The only problem with that, again, especially in America, with its very rigid two-party system, but also to an extent over here, is that for a long time now, at least since the early 1990s, I'd argue, and the rise of Clinton and Blair on the coattails of the end of history, there hasn't really been an avenue to fundamentally challenge this particular iteration of the system. Your options at the ballot box have basically been restricted to managers of the status quo, different flavors of the same ice cream. Until Trump. Donald Trump, whatever you think of him and the solutions, such as they are, that he proposes, it has to be acknowledged that he offers a fundamental break with the system. Which brings us to the question of what do we do in such a situation? I think the first thing to say, and some people aren't going to like this, is that we have to be more open-minded about the shape of the world in the medium to long term, and possibly even in the short term. The shape of our institutions, the way our society is run and governed. Just as the medieval peasant in 15th century Europe, tied to the land, couldn't have imagined global cities, the democratic institutions of today, so we can have little concept of how our societies will function when the changes brought about by the digital revolution really begin to kick in. Again, we're just at the very start of it now. New technology is coming on stream at a dizzying pace, especially in the field of artificial intelligence. We don't know exactly how it will change our lives. The only thing we can be sure of is that it will, and radically so. In a way, the easiest part of the question to answer is also the one that seems most immediately pressing, right? The geopolitical question. I think we need to recognize quickly that the United States is, under the current administration, basically a rogue state. Allow me another apocryphal quote. I'll ask you, sir, if you know who said it. America has no permanent friends or enemies, only interests. No, it's attributed to Henry Kissinger, but he didn't, as far as I'm aware, ever say that. It was, in fact, Lord Palmerston in the 19th century, leader of the preeminent global power of the day. But the quote is useful because it helps us to ask the right question. The United States is retreating from its alliances, especially in Europe, and from its defense of a certain set of values around the world, freedom and democracy. Now, admittedly, that was a project with a pretty spotty record, and we could have a whole separate lecture on that, but let's leave that there. What, in its current iteration, are the interests and values of the United States? The answer at the moment is, I think, Donald J. Trump. His MAGA coalition, fragile and fractious though it is, has become a cult of personality. And we need to reckon with that. Seeing the world with clear eyes is the first step. But then we need to ask, especially as journalists, how do we deal with a world in which not just alliances are fracturing, but reality itself? How do we deal with a political force underpinned by new technology that says war is peace, that operates under the principle that ignorance is strength, and may soon tell you that slavery is freedom? With a little apology to George Orwell for slightly messing with his quote. First of all, I'm not a complete postmodernist. I do think there is truth out there. Truth exists. And the first job of a journalist is to establish facts and use those facts to tell true stories. But I also think that the truth is more slippery and more multifaceted than we sometimes like to think, especially at a time of great change. So I think it's incumbent on us all, but journalists especially, to do two things. First, we should be less concerned with blindly trying to defend the status quo. This is difficult at a time when we face an all-out assault on our institutions, on the fabric of reality itself. But we must try to think, what are the changes we should like to see? The world is evolving rapidly and fundamentally, and there's nothing we can do to stop that, Trump or no Trump. But we can help to shape it. Those in power in America at the moment understand that. They are harnessing this moment in history to shape the future of the world according to their image. And we should not cede all the ground to them. Second, we must engage with the stories coming from outside of our information silos. If I learn one thing from spending years down the rabbit hole reporting the coming storm, it's this: don't ignore the weird guys. Don't ignore the stories that seem at first sight too ridiculous, too obviously bogus or mendacious to bother with. Hidden in those stories are pearls of truth about how the world is changing around us, who's driving that change, and how to navigate this turbulent time. These wild stories are part of the roadmap of our future. And that future begins right now. The storm has come, and you better get ready. Thank you.
Oh, that was fantastic, Gabriel. I think everyone was sort of, I think after the few weeks that we've had as well, it was absolutely the right time to hear those words and to think about what it's going to mean.
I kept starting to write this and I had to rip it up.
Safety again, no, exactly. So I think there was a line, I think, that when you spoke at Donald Trump, you described, not very much. You say that a pathological liar and fantasist with clear totalitarian instincts has regained power in America with a whopping democratic mandate. Does that not then indicate it was a massive failing on the part of the media that wasn't able to highlight truths about him? Or was it the fault of the media for working to maintain the status quo?
I think the latter. I mean, the media did a pretty good job, I think, of highlighting his mendacious and totalitarian tendencies during his first term, and then during the brief Biden interregnum. There's no shortage of coverage of that, right? So
Except people didn't want to hear it or didn't believe it.
Well, some people didn't believe it. Yeah. So, but that's not. I don't think that is the media's fault. I think I think the fault, if the fault is to be found with the media, which in part I think it is the fact that the media, a bit like the Democrats, got railroaded into becoming defenders of the status quo. And it turns out no one likes the status quo. Not no one, but a majority of people in America don't, and there's polling to back it up.
Absolutely. But I suppose where that comes from, that the status quo is quite often, or it may be felt, is been based on facts and truths. And at what point, how hard are we should we be fighting for those truths, or how much should we be giving airtime to the weird guy?
Well, we shouldn't ignore the weird guy, but I think the status quo is based on power dynamics, actually, more than facts and truths. The facts and truths are there to bolster the power dynamic, and they may be true facts, but, and without wanting to get to Sean Spicer on this, there are often alternative facts, or facts from a different perspective. So, a small example which relates to the UK, when I was during the run-up to the Brexit referendum, I was working at Newsnight, and one of my colleagues who was good at crunching numbers and like big economic stuff went out to somewhere outside London to, do the vox pop and get his dirt under his fingernails, speak to the people, find out what they wanted. And he sat in this cafe with these three lovely middle-aged ladies, and they were complaining about how the economy was going down the pan. And my colleague said, well, actually, that's not right. The economy isn't going down the pan. The economy is much better than it was 5 years ago, or whatever he said. And this is backed up by facts and figures from the Bank of England. Mark Carney himself just brought them out last week. And one of these ladies said, well, I don't think Mark Carney shops in my local Sainsbury's. And people, there was a sort of slight tittering in the newsroom about these silly little people who, and in fact that was entirely the wrong reaction, of course. And this is what I mean by alternative facts, right? This woman's experience of the economy was in opposition to Mark Carney's experience of the economy and the story that figures told. And both of those things were true. They didn't cancel each other out. But I think the media, with its kind of terrible lack of diversity in all senses, but especially in the sort of class sense, often misses the stories of that part of society, which is why we all missed Brexit, why we all missed.
We'll come to lots of questions. I'm sure we've got absolutely loads. But just going back on that alternative facts thing, I'm sure there's quite a few people sitting here who might feel slightly uncomfortable about. Because what's interesting is for the last, 8-10 years, the idea of alternative facts as a concept has been something that's sat very much with the right, and particularly with Trump.
Yeah.
Do you think maybe then progressives or people on the left should have embraced the concept of alternative facts?
Well, I think people in the centre should embrace a concept of alternative facts, because this is about a multiplicity of viewpoints and acknowledging that not everyone's experience is...
But is that a fact? A viewpoint is quite different to a fact, isn't it?
Well, it's how you experience the world, the way you experience the economy, and you can experience the if you are working 3 jobs just to make ends meet, and every week your grocery bill is slightly more unaffordable, if the macroeconomic figures say the economy is getting better, that doesn't mean your economic life is getting better. It's not an alternative fact. It's just another fact shining a light on the same issue from a different angle. It's not about kind of factual or moral relativism. It's about a more 3D picture of the world.
And I think there's an interesting thing that you said there as well about the need for greater diversity within journalism and most certainly diversity of thought, and how much perhaps within our media there has been almost sort of self-censorship that comes from the sort of self-selection of people who get to the top of journalism, of people who are going to kind of agree with a certain set of ideas, they've got a similar education, they've got a similar... And obviously we're sitting here today with lots of young journalists, and how significant a problem is that? Is that what's led us here?
I think it's a very significant problem. Now, obviously, I've done very well in journalism out of looking and sounding like the kind of guy who ought to be a journalist, right? That's, I look and sound like the guy who might well be a BBC foreign correspondent. And there you are, hey presto, the doors were open to me. I think I was good at my job as well. But I think if I'd looked and sounded differently, but had all the same skills, or had come from a different kind of economic background, I might have faced...
I had a hat with horns on it.
If I had a hat with horns on it. So I do think that what you said, story selection, and the bias in which stories you pick up on and think are important and are newsworthy, and which stories you don't, is obviously a factor of the people who are working in journalism. I think the advent of the internet, of YouTube, Facebook, and all of that, which has kind of turned everyone into, I don't want to say journalists or reporters. They think they are, but they're not, because there's actually, surprise, surprise, some skill and art to being journalists and verifying facts and all that kind of stuff, which I don't want to minimize. But it has turned everyone into a broadcast machine, basically. And so it's become much more obvious to everybody that the picture of my world represented on my screen or in my newspaper doesn't represent the picture of my world that I can see represented on my little screen. Yes. And hold on a second, why the hell is that? And so you're fake news and, blah, blah, blah. And so, the technology has obviously exacerbated what is a real problem. It's not like it's not like it's not a problem. It is a problem.
But beyond that, we know with Donald Trump, he is deliberately going out of his way to make the media the enemy. Mm-hmm. He's frequently called them enemies of the people. He's encouraged people to jeer at the media. He's his rallies. That's a very sort of straight out the kind of the authoritarian playbook. Mm-hmm. So a lot of this stuff is being done to the media, isn't it? And how does the media fight back? How do they do their job?
It's really difficult to answer that question. I think that we mustn't lose sight of the fact of the basics, which is that the job of journalism is to uncover facts and tell true stories with those facts. That is the job of journalism. So, and just in case it needs spelling out, the job of journalism is not to put factually inaccurate or false things that aren't true and then build a story out of that, right? So those are the things that we absolutely have to hold on to. And I firmly believe that it's much more important as a journalistic organization to focus on making sure that every story you tell has that kind of solid factual basis, and that as a journalist, when you're looking at a story and you encounter a fact that frustrates your narrative, that knocks your narrative off course, that you don't just weed that out and go, well, that's difficult and inconvenient. If it totally cancels your narrative, obviously you should spike your story. But if it's sort of, it doesn't quite fit, I'll ignore that. And there's another bit that doesn't quite fit, I'll ignore that as well. Don't do that, right? Yes. Because that's when you get the kind of, you can tell a non-true story with true facts that way. Yes. Right? So don't do that. I don't think I'm kind of providing solutions here, but the sort of rules of, I think that's much more important than having dedicated debunking programs in your newspaper or your broadcaster, which is basically playing a thankless game of whack-a-mole that you're never going to win.
And we'll just come to questions, but just finally, I wanted to ask, because a lot of your work is based on the US. How much of an information crisis do you think we already have here in the UK?
I think we're slightly less far advanced, partly because of Ofcom. We have Ofcom, and Ofcom is much criticised and maligned as but at least we have it. Yes. Right? We have a code of conduct in the broadcast world which is not existent in America, and that has, really all of this kind of began with the competition between the broadcasters, yes. CNN, Fox, all these people trying to outdo each other with kind of outrage, and that kind of has turned American news television into basically garbage. Yes. I mean, it's just total rubbish, right? I mean, and it goes for all of them. In 2020, when Biden was declared the winner, I was in a hotel room it must have been Phoenix, in fact, and I remember watching CNN, and I thought the tone of this coverage was just so awful. I had to switch to Fox because it was better, because their guy had lost, and so there was a bit of, So I think, and of course, there is a move to create the same broadcast environment here in the UK, and GBUs is the kind of first salvo in that, blah blah blah. I think that now, where we're getting a lot of our news not through broadcasters anymore, but through our social media, that argument, that ship has kind of sailed, and we need to figure out a way of having an Ofcom for social media. I have no idea how that might work. I think, unfortunately, where America leads, we inevitably tend to follow quite rapidly.
Got any good news?
Sorry.
Yes. No good news.
Any good news? Just give me a second. I'll come up with something.
Let's get to questions first, though, while we're waiting. Oh, sorry, this gentleman here.
So, Gabriel, thank you for a most entertaining, riveting lecture. Just before I came out this afternoon, I heard just briefly Mr. Trump announced that he thought that Russia had been unfairly pounding Ukraine, and then actually he was considering severe and crushing sanctions against Russia. My point being that I think that the progressive liberal media has rushed to judgment on Trump in the last week. We are at Act 1, C1 of this particular presidency. I myself was also a BBC journalist for many years. And my view of the BBC came to it was also in the business of constructing reality. That's why eventually I left BBC and wrote about it, because I think that the idea of BBC's impartiality is fraudulent. Now, there are many things one could say about Trump. I also found watching him bully Zelensky last week a deeply uncomfortable thing. But, for instance, when he was talking to Congress the other night, and he called out the absurdity, as I would see it, of the trains, was he not then also calling out a movement which had quite mistaken, trying to mould reality into a quite absurd form of shape? So my point to you is that there is a clerisy of journalists, establishment journalists, who by and large view the world through the same prism. I think you're a fine journalist. I think you both those people. And blame you for it. And just putting point two, we need more diversity of opinion within our journalism if we are actually to see the woman straight.
I fully agree with you, a point I think I was making just now. I do agree with you. I think you're right. We are at Act 1, maybe Scene 2 of the Trump presidency. I do think we should listen to what Donald Trump says, and he's made it quite clear that he does not want to be the backstop and guarantor of security in Europe. And he swings wildly from one thing to the other. And so I think it's reasonable for Europe to conclude that it can't rely on that for its security, which is my point about turning the global order upside down. I mean, I'm not in charge of making these great big policy decisions, but I would not be basing my security on somebody who says one thing one day and the opposite the next, and then the next day pretends he never said that other thing. And it's untenable. So I'm just saying, as a geopolitical fact, I think the transatlantic alliance is over. It's not a question of whether you agree with Donald Trump or disagree with him on his trans ideas or whatever. It's just a question of whether you think this is a reliable partner.
Thank you. There's a gentleman there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I add my thanks for a very stimulating talk, Gabriel. Thank you. I want to take you back to the comment that you made about your view that Trump and his henchmen made a strategic blunder in humiliating Zelensky at the White House. And much as we're all revolted by this, I wanted to first of all ask you whether you think this might be a sort of Western European perspective, and might be many other people in the rest of the world who actually have a rather different perspective. And related to that, strategic blunders have consequences beyond just changing perceptions. I wanted to know whether you could articulate a little bit about your view of what those consequences might be.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there are two very good questions. I think the reason I call it a blunder is I think by stabbing an ally in the back so publicly, he basically signed away all of America's soft power. Because, in the past, America could rely on its role as the backstop of European security to have influence and make people do things without having to actually fire a shot. in that meeting, I think he ended that, right? And so therefore he also ceded a lot of America's soft power. And so America is now left in a position where it has hard power. And it has a lot of hard power. And this is a country that is led by a man who likes to demonstrate his power. And in my view, at least, will now struggle to do so in a soft way. So the implications of that, I fear, and I may be wrong, but this is my analysis of the situation, is that Trump, having been elected to office on the promise of ending America's forever wars, a noble aim, I would say, actually becomes more likely to be one that will engage in offensive action as a result of that.
Thanks very much, first of all. I really enjoyed your lecture. One might argue that a reason that the general public turn away from, say, statistics given to them by the Bank of England or that the BBC report is because people increasingly feel as if their lived experience is misaligned with what they are told about the world and the state of, say, the economy. What I am confused about, though, is why are they not necessarily then turning to, say, those outlets or sources that, project their lived experiences and their alternative facts, say in the form of, platforming the opinions of the working class or platforming these opinions, which they might be able to relate to and then feel as if they're being represented. Why instead do we see people turning to conspiracy about cabals and pedophiles? Do you think that's symptomatic of the information age and the algorithm, or do you think we just tend to prefer the ridiculous and the unbelievable in order to explain what's wrong with our world and why our lives are like this?
I think your point about cognitive dissonance is a very, very powerful one, and I think that's exactly right. It's people see the way that the world is portrayed by quote unquote the media, and they're like, this has nothing to do with this, and therefore, you guys are lying to me, right? That's the vibe. And so, okay, why do people then why don't they turn to alternative media outlets that portray the world? Maybe there aren't enough good alternative media outlets staffed by experienced journalists who come from a different background, but who nevertheless know what it is to be a journalist, to uncover facts, to verify facts, and then to, crucially, we were talking about this earlier, to tell a compelling story with those facts, not just to present facts, because facts on their own, they don't mean anything. You need to tell a story with those facts. Maybe those media outlets either aren't strong enough, aren't good enough, there aren't enough of them. I think the algorithm that you talk about is absolutely part of the problem. I mean, the business model of all of these social media companies is outrage, alternative views on the Bank of England statistics are not as outrageous as cabals and paedophiles, unfortunately, right? So, and in times of confusion, people reach for conspiracy theories, especially the kinds of conspiracy theories that are around at the moment, especially like QAnon, which have this sort of weirdly participatory nature to them, whereas you're not just a recipient of secret information which can make you feel sort of privileged and knowledgeable, but you are participating in this. You become, by being part of this movement, you become part of the war against the cabal. You are taking back power and ownership of your uncertain world, which is a very beguiling and understandable thing for people to want to do. And so I think that's why people reach for conspiracy theories. And that is why also we shouldn't laugh at people who reach for conspiracy theories. This is something that people do for a good reason. and it's not just nutters and weirdos on the right who are susceptible to them. And there are lots of nutters and weirdos on the left, and there are lots of nutters and weirdos in the centre. And the nutters and weirdos in the centre are perhaps the nuttiest and weirdest of them all, because they think they're not the nutters and the weirdos. So, yeah, and, you know, America was consumed by a centrist conspiracy theory for much of Trump's first presidency, which was that there was a secret P-tape, and Donald Trump was a Kremlin agent, for which there was no evidence. It's like, but this still persists. And when I wrote a piece for a newspaper earlier this week saying, guys, there was no P-tape and this was a conspiracy theory, and I get deluged by centrist nutters telling me that I'm wicked and evil and covering up for Trump's crimes. And I'm like, where is the evidence? Anyway.
Just going back to your weeks and decades, the last 7 weeks seems rather like the 1930s in Germany, unfortunately. But if he goes this far in 7 weeks, where do you think he'll end up? Or will he end up? Will he last 4 years?
Despite your comment that I had some kind of crystal ball and knew the future, I sadly don't. Where will he end up? I mean, look, Trump is I do think this. Trump is just pure id. He's instinct, and that's what makes him a brilliant politician, right? He's just like, he gets it, and he knows instinctually where the wind is blowing and where the mood of a crowd is, and he's like, he is actually quite brilliant, sort of in that way. But the people around him, the MAGA coalition, is an extremely fractious and diverse thing, and contains some very big egos alongside the very big ego of Donald Trump. You know, how long Elon Musk and Donald Trump can continue to share an office is not clear to me, but I would be willing to sort of put some money on the fact that they're on the suggestion that their relationship might not last the full 4 years. Who knows what will happen then? But look, you know, different wings of the MAGA coalition want different things, right? So there's the sort of Steve Bannon wing, the kind of nativist. I always get in trouble when I call them white supremacist, and it's sort of a bit more nuanced. But that, you know what I mean, right? Wing of the MAGA coalition, which wants to make America great again in a kind of 1950s sort of way, where, you know, women are back in the kitchen and you know, the sort of trappings of 1950s America when things felt like they were on the upswing. The tech bros wing of the MAGA coalition wants nothing like that. They want all the, you know, they want the immigrant visas for the workers to come in. They want to get rid of all the tax. They don't want big state programs that are going to provide stable jobs for steel workers in Ohio. They want to get rid of all social security and protection and regulation. Some of them want to get rid of the federal government, right? They want to get rid of the state. They want to destroy America, and they want to create a sort of sci-fi future in which people live in franchised statelets where you choose your citizenship the same way you choose your gym membership. Now, these two visions of making America great again are obviously not compatible. So where this will end up is anyone's guess. I think it will end up with a lot of piles of burning ash and a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth from people like me.
That was terrific. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you.